Welcome to Agatha Christie She Watched, the spoiler-heavy podcast in which we talk about Agatha Christie movie adaptations. This is Bill Peschel from Peschel Press, and this week we're talking about a sinister collector of rare artifacts, naughty pictures, and the game of bridge. Yes, it's Cards on the Table, the 2006 adaptation starring David Suchet as Hercule Poirot. But first, let me introduce my partner in marriage and crime of the fictional sort, Teresa Peschel. Teresa, how you doing?
Hi, Bill. It's always a thrill to be here with you in your office under the stairs. And before I forget, I want to do a shameless plug for an upcoming event that we're going to be doing. For those of you who are in the state of Delaware on Saturday, the 6th of August in 2022, we are going to be at the Wyoming Peach Festival. So if you want to come out and meet us in person, we will be at the Wyoming Peach Festival somewhere in the Sea of Canopies. That is Saturday, the 6th of August in 2022.
This is Wyoming, Delaware, not Wyoming, the state of Wyoming. It's a town just outside of Dover.
The Peach Festival is supposed to be one of the great regional festivals of Delaware, so we will find out.
Yep. So, Cards on the Table. Initial thoughts?
I was really grooving on this movie. I was really enjoying it. They did a beautiful job. They introduced Ariadne Oliver right away instead of her coming in suddenly later. They were following the text pretty closely, considering this is a movie adaptation. And then about halfway through, I started saying, what, as things started changing. And then it completely fell apart at the ending, and the ending was terrible. I was so disappointed because they completely changed the character of Anne Meredith and Rhoda Dawes. It's like the screenwriter swapped their lines, and I can really understand why Superintendent Battle flatly refused to show up for this production, as did Colonel Race, because they knew better.
We'll get into that a little bit later. The movie started out pretty close to the book, right?
Considering that it is a film adaptation, yes, I think it did, because they have to get moving right away, and so we get Ariadne and Poirot at the same exhibit that Mr. Shaitana is at. They're all drifting around looking at bizarre sculptures. Shaitana starts chatting up Poirot. Shaitana has a remarkable mustache, too, although probably not quite as perfect in its symmetry and exuberance as Poirot, or at least Poirot would have you think so. Shaitana and Poirot do know of each other, although, of course, he's never showed up before in any of the books. And Shaitana has an interesting hobby. He collects rarities, the most rare of rarities. He is talking about collecting things related to crime, and Poirot instantly assumes it is a black museum. That's where you collect the hangman's rope and, knives used to murder important people.
Scotland Yard is known for having a black museum. That's where it comes from.
Why do they call it the Black Museum? Mr. Black started it?
No, but because it's artifacts of the kind that you don't normally want to show in public. So it's, black as sinister.
Oh, sounds like your porn museum, but only in another direction.
It's not my porn museum. I don't have one. don't
if
say
you did,
you
I
in
would
that
certainly know about it by now.
Yeah. So anyway, Shaitana is Syrian, as we finally find out, and he is well cast. They cast a great actor for that.
Yes, he is supposed to look like Mephistopheles. And he does.
Mm-hmm.
And he does.
Well, Shaitana is Arabic for devil?
Something like that. I caught a little glimpse of that somewhere. Something like that. She chose that name very, very carefully.
Mm-hmm.
And he is a collector of, as I said, of rarities. And the rarity collection that he has, as Poirot discovers, they do this kind of in a flashback because they want to surprise the audience, obviously. But he has collected murderers who got away with it. And he is inviting them to dinner. And he invites the 4 detectives, which is Poirot for private detective, Ariadne Oliver as a mystery writer, Superintendent Wheeler representing Scotland Yard, and that he's taking the place of Superintendent Battle, who had enough sense not to show up for this fiasco, and then Colonel Hughes in the place of Colonel Race, who again is off doing something better with his time in the far reaches of the Empire. And the 4 people that are invited as the other guests, that is Anne Meredith, who is a poor relation, a paid companion, young and pretty and nervous. She has, as it turned out, she did indeed kill someone. Well, no, wait, sorry. She killed someone in the novel. In the film, they completely switched it around. You get Major Despard, who shot someone. You get John Roberts, who probably poisoned at least one of his patients, and you get Mrs. Lorimer, who murdered her husband.
So they're all brought together, and of course we're not told right off the bat. They're not informed, of course, but during the dinner, Shaitana insinuates that there's obviously everything he says can be applied to the 4 detectives. The 4 other people, we don't know why they're there, and they don't know too much why they're there. They've some of them met Shaitana in Egypt, right?
Yes, Mrs. Lorimer met him in Egypt. Major Despard had met him at other parties, as did John Roberts. Anne Meredith, she met him around and about, although in the novel it's actually spelled out that she met Shaitana when she was with Rhoda Dawes at a week in Switzerland in the winter for skiing. Rhoda Dawes is the one who has the money in that relationship, and they're good friends. They went to school together. A lot of what was actually in the text made it into the film, and other things that were never in the text appeared out of nowhere. But the point is that the 4 people who were invited, Shaitana knows that they are all guilty of murder. They got away with it. Poirot is the only one of the 4 detectives who knows this, because he tells the other detectives that Shaitana had told him this, apparently in the museum. I'm a little blurry on the flashbacks, but I believe that that's what actually happened, is that there was a flashback scene for just a few seconds where you see Poirot listening to Shaitana tell him that I collect murderers who got away with it. And then Poirot informs the rest of the quartet that is why those 4 people were there at the dinner, and that is why Shaitana said very pointed remarks that could be aimed at a specific person.
Right, and he also says in the tropes of mystery novels that at the end of the bridge game that they're going to have, he's going to make an announcement. He's going to reveal a secret.
He's going to reveal a secret, thereby putting the pressure on the 4 murderers sitting there at the table. That, oh my God, the idea, of course, is that each one of these 4 murderers is sitting at the table, sweating it out over the lobster Newburg of, oh my God, he's going to say in front of a representative of Scotland Yard, a world-renowned private detective, and somebody from MI5 or MI6, something like that.
Yeah, I think just the Overseas Colonial Service.
So, a prototype James Bond and a mystery novelist who will use this as fodder for her next book. Oh my God, all is going to be revealed, and my life is ruined. I'm going to end up in the dock, and I'm going to be hanged.
And we do get some of that sometimes, because it was really fun watching Ariadne Oliver, because you could see Agatha kind of revealing something of her mindset, because there was a particular moment when she was talking with Anne and Rhoda and started speculating about who could have done it. And they asked her, so can you figure out a way that it could have, a motive for this? And she said,
she just started rattling them off like any good mystery writer would, none of which had anything to do with reality, by the way. But she started just rattling them off, because that's the way it works. You have ideas are everywhere. You have to kick them out of the way.
So they start after the dinner, they start the bridge game, and they have the 4 murderers at one table in one room, and then Poirot and the 3 other people in the other room.
Yes, they're playing bridge in the other room. This is after everybody being seated at the big dinner party.
Yeah, Shaitana wanders around smoking a cigarette, looking over everyone's shoulder.
And then he sits down in the chair facing the fireplace. He's had a great dinner, and he's had a couple of glasses of great wine, and he is very comfortable. He just settles in, and he does what is a little odd, but at the same time you can kind of understand it. He falls asleep in front of the fire, because why wouldn't you?
Right.
And I do want to say something about the dinner party scene. This is something that most of us readers, certainly not for me, this is not the kind of dinner party I have ever been invited to, where I'm wearing my best evening wear, and I have on my statement jewelry, and I'm seated boy, girl, are all the way around this grand, lavishly arrayed table, meeting essentially complete strangers and yet making pleasant conversation with them. This is a real talent. It's a real skill. I think that when Agatha was using this, she was using something that actually she saw happen in her own life, that you would invite people who didn't know each other that well or didn't know each other at all, and you would have dinner parties to introduce one set of people to a different set of people.
I think this happens a lot more in England than it does in the United States.
I think so too. This is not something that seems to happen in the United States.
Or at least at the parties we get invited to.
Which isn't many, folks. It isn't many. But it's a great scene. It really is a wonderful scene. You can see how uncomfortable, particularly Anne Meredith, is. She is out of her league. She is the youngest person in the room by probably 20 years. She's obviously in her early to mid-20s. Major Despard is probably the next youngest man in the room in his 30s. A man in his prime. Ariadne could be in her 40s. Hercule, as we know, he's been 60 forever. Mr. Shaitana is certainly in his 40s. Superintendent Wheeler has he's not a 22-year-old any more than Colonel Hughes is.
So anyway, at the end of the bridge party, detectives come in. Superintendent Wheeler leans over Shaitana and discovers he is dead.
He is dead.
He's stabbed in the heart.
Stabbed in the heart with what looks like a jeweled hat pin. They call it a dagger in the novel, but they didn't use it. It doesn't really look like a dagger because it doesn't have the proper handle or hilt that a dagger would have. It's a big, fancy, like you could see it as a ring, a big fancy door knocker ring or a big fancy brooch.
It reminds me of your long needles at your desk, at your sewing machine, which has kind of like a pearl on the end, which is...
Corsage pins.
Yeah, corsage pin, only really much bigger, so you could put it in your palm and jam it into the chest.
It is like a cross between a hat pin and a dagger because it's got the fancy end of a hat pin, and it's got the blade of a dagger about 6 inches long. It has obviously been rammed into Mr. Shaitana's heart, and he never said a word. He didn't speak. He didn't even grunt. He did what happens in mystery novels, but probably doesn't happen in real life, which is he just, and conks out.
Well, and also when he had a glass in his hand and they discovered residue in it, and they discovered there was sleeping powder in it.
Yes, so clearly it was premeditated. This was not in the book, and I couldn't accept it. Do you want to get to that point yet, or not?
Well, he didn't take he wasn't drugged in the book.
No.
Oh, okay.
No, he wasn't planning on seeing if one of his.
Well, we'll save that for the end because there's a little bit to go into because
it worked so well.
Oh,
the first half was great.
Yeah, there was fascinating characters, scintillating dialogue, interesting characters, and then we start investigating the 4 murderers.
Yes, because the 4 people playing bridge, and you don't have to know bridge in order to appreciate the novel or enjoy the movie. You don't have to know bridge.
They do use it because Poirot does use the bridge scores to discern character.
Yes, because the bridge scores, as well as the dissection of the bridge hand, give him an idea of the personality of each of the victims. Mrs. Lorimer is a very precise, skillful player. She really knows her stuff. She plans ahead. She calculates. She is not going to overbid.
Well, he compares it with he asks them with questions about the bridge game, but he also asks them about the objects in the room, and the comparison makes for a in-depth characterization because Mrs. Lorimer couldn't tell what was going on around her.
But she knew every single hand of the bridge game that they played, all 4 rubbers. She knew every single hand in every single rubber. She was able to dissect who did what, who held what cards, even, what card they held, what they did, a whole lot of bridge terms that I don't know what they mean because I don't play bridge. But she didn't know anything in the room other than, well, there's furniture.
Right. Whereas Anne recognized the Egyptian objects.
Yes, she appreciated the jewelry. Now, one of the things that they did not put in the film that they did in the novel, and this was a telling point for Poirot, Anne Meredith, poor paid companion, saw that there was a vase of chrysanthemums that needed their water changed. But she did not notice, according to Poirot, if she had liked flowers, she did not notice the big bowl of early tulips, which any flower fancier would have liked. No, she noticed the one that needed someone's attention, but she couldn't appreciate the flowers on their own. She also noticed the jewelry, the pretty jewelry. Major Despard, he noticed that there was furniture in the room. He did notice the rugs, because rugs were something that he knew about. He noticed the fine quality of the rugs. He did not like Mr. Shaitana, by the way, at all. He also noticed, it didn't make it into the film, but it was in the novel, and again, it displays his temperament. He noticed the taxidermied head of an eland. Now, Dr. Roberts, he didn't really remember the bridge hands, although he was a skillful bridge player, but he really noticed all of the objects in the room. He noticed the rugs, he noticed the furniture, he noticed the upholstery. He was a very observant person. And this gives you kind of a feel for the personality of the murderers, because it had to be one of those 4.
Although there was a point, and we disagreed on this, because Poirot turns to Superintendent Wheeler and says, "You could have done it too."
Yes, and that was absolutely atrocious, and you understand why Superintendent Battle refused to show up for this particular casting call, because, oh my God, they decided that Superintendent Wheeler was not just a substitute for Battle, and we never see enough of Superintendent Battle, and we should, because he's a great character. But no, Superintendent Wheeler has a secret gay past, which is clearly evident in the fact that he mentions, it's after midnight at the dinner, "I have to go home to my wife and children." He mentions his wife and children at least twice, maybe even 3 times in the course of the film, and that is clearly suspicious, because why would anyone announce, "I have to go home to my wife and children," unless you're hiding the fact that you have a secret gay sex life?
But not the fact, though, that he was being suspected of murder, though, because that was something that we saw in the 2008 adaptation of Appointment with Death, because Lady Westholm goes up to check on the old lady, and that's when she stabs her.
Well, that's true. That's true. I'd completely forgotten about that. And yes, of course, Poirot is remembering that.
Obviously.
Obviously remembering that.
But it's funny to see the tropes returning again and again, because Mr. Shaitana calling in these 4 murderers is also used in And Then There Were None, only for a different purpose.
That's right. Oh my God, that's right. And in fact, there's a subtext. They did, again, the film didn't have enough time to bring it out, but the novel did more, where Poirot and Superintendent Battle josh Ariadne Oliver about reusing plots. And Poirot actually goes into detail about a pair of them, where if you strip away everything else, the mechanism is the same. And Ariadne Oliver is astonished that he noticed, because most people never do.
Absolutely. He gives her the titles in this adaptation, and she owns up to it, because she says, "I didn't know you read them." And he said, "Oh yes, I have issues with them." And then she goes, "Oh yes, I know this drug is not soluble in water." Like, she has been told this repeatedly, and all she can do is just say, "Well, it's writing. I don't know what else to say. It's fiction. I can't do this."
It's fiction, folks.
But you are right about Superintendent Wheeler being outed as gay, because what ends up happening is that as part of the investigation, they're trying to track down photographs, because we see Shaitana with a camera. When he's in Egypt with those lovely Nile backdrops with each of the characters, he takes their pictures. So there's a setup that, he's taking a lot of pictures. And I can't remember how it leads them to the photographer. Do you?
Poirot he's back at Shaitana's absolutely gorgeous house, drop dead gorgeous, and he is looking at this big photograph of Shaitana. It has a very Dali surrealist look of his face reflected in a mirror in multiple hands. Poirot notices in the lower corner there's a tiny plaque that is the name of the photographer. So he goes to that photographer, who is clearly gay, very campy, and he's setting up this posed photograph with young men in Greek drapery holding up grapes in front of each other. You might as well be hit over the head with a subtext in this, and I'll get to that with Anne and Rhoda later on. Moreau, who is the photographer, says, "Oh yes, Shaitana said eventually somebody would come by to get these photographs." And the implication is that he knows what the pictures are, because of course he developed them. He does all of the developing.
Yeah, so he has to know.
And Poirot looks at the pictures. We're never shown the pictures, but it is clearly blackmailing material. And it is, of course, Superintendent Wheeler, naked and frolicking, I guess with Shaitana or with someone else. I have no idea. And you wonder why a senior superintendent at Scotland Yard, he might be frolicking naked with male companions, but he's not going to let any photographs be taken. On the other hand, people do stupid stuff every day.
Before Poirot reveals that, when he does the Poirot at the end, he holds up the photos and looking at them, and he's also implying that the true murderer is actually in them, which means that obviously Shaitana takes pictures of all his frolics, I guess.
Except that we don't think he hasn't met any of the other people. He knows them casually.
Right.
He knows Mrs. Lorimer, Major Despard, Anne Meredith. He knows them casually.
But obviously he knows Roberts a lot more.
Well, we don't know. We don't know that he knows Roberts a lot more. The implication is that he knows Wheeler a lot more.
Well, but Roberts reacted to it when Poirot fooled him with it, because he was saying, he's pulling out these photos at the end and saying, "We have these photos, Dr. Roberts."
Oh.
And that's when Roberts says, "All right, you got me." So there's a big relationship there as well.
Oh, yes. Apparently, Dr. Roberts is flamingly gay. He has relationships with at least one of his patients, and his patient's wife got angry. This was Mrs. Craddock, and the secretary thinks that he was having a torrid affair with Mrs. Craddock because Dr. Roberts is a ladies' man. But no, he was having an affair with Mr. Craddock, and Mrs. Craddock objected, and that's why he had to kill them.
Because she was going to raise a ruckus about it, and then she was... And again, this is where... This is all where it's all starting to fall apart, because, of course, she's upset with him, and at the same time, she's there to get shots so that she can go to Egypt, because she needs inoculations to enter the country. And all I could think of is if you're accusing him of fooling around with your husband and you're going to report him to the medical society, the last thing I would want him to do is put his hands on me.
That's right. You'd find a different doctor. There are plenty of doctors.
Yeah.
And that didn't make any sense. In the novel, Mrs. Craddock wants to have the affair with Dr. Roberts, and she wants him to put his hands on her. It's her husband who objects to it, but her husband by this time has died of anthrax from an infected shaving brush, which sounded extremely specious to me, but whatever. So Mrs. Craddock, she's now a widow. Of course she wants to go continue seeing Dr. Roberts. He's a handsome doctor, and now she can legitimately have him put his hands all over her because she's a widow.
As you can see, what's ended up happening in this episode, because we've seen numerous adaptations where they've changed things. They've added characters, dropped characters, added whole subplots. But here it's like they flicked the switch.
Oh, yes. They flicked the switch. This is going to be a gay film, as gay as Old Perry. So you have Dr. Craddock. He's unmarried, and so, of course, he must be absolutely flamingly gay. You have Superintendent Wheeler, who obviously has a gay sex life that his wife and children know nothing about, and neither does Scotland Yard. You have Mr. Shaitana, who probably has a wide experience because it's just implied in the text. You have the gay photographer and his charming young men who pose in Greek draperies for art photography. Then you get Anne Meredith living with her friend Rhoda Dawes. Anne and Rhoda knew each other in school. Anne's mother has been gone for a number of years, and her father died and left her in poverty, and she had to go off and become basically a paid companion because you have no money and you have no training, and that's what you do. And she's living with Rhoda. The implication is that she is Rhoda's slave, and they have a gay love life. Rhoda is the dominant partner, and Rhoda is very angry about Anne possibly flirting with Major Despard, and there's nothing like this in the text. Then it turns out that no, Anne Meredith did not her employer by giving her the poison in the wrong jar. No, it was Rhoda who swapped the bottles.
Some of these things I didn't like about them because they were not set up well. Because first of all, we never saw Rhoda at the woman's house until afterwards. It was what happened is Anne was using the silver polish to polish the silver. The jar broke.
She poured it into an empty
medicine jar.
An empty medicine jar. It's syrup of figs, which is, I think, a laxative of some sort. And so it was not, of course, relabeled, and it was put up in the cleaning cupboard because everybody would know that it was silver polish. And somebody put the syrup of figs into the medicine cabinet that the old lady used, that she took a swig from every night before she went to bed to get her bowels to work, and she poisoned herself. And oh, it was a terrible accident.
Again, it wasn't set up properly. We, like I said, didn't know Rhoda was there.
But worst of all, it was when eventually it's all revealed, it wasn't Anne doing this, who is shown to be a thief. By the way, she is shown to be a thief. She steals the stockings. But again, if you don't set Anne Meredith up as a thief, it doesn't make sense that she's going to steal 2 of the pairs of incredibly expensive French silk stockings.
What it also did when they flipped this, because in the book, Anne doesn't go off with Major Despard.
No, it's Rhoda. What happens is that Anne tries to drown Rhoda in the book because Anne recognizes that Rhoda is the only person who would be able to tell Poirot and the team of detectives about the old lady's death, which everybody accepted as an accident, including the old lady. Everybody accepted it as an accident, but Anne knew it wasn't. She knew what she had done. And Rhoda is going to blab, and so she has to defend herself from Rhoda. She has to protect herself, and she's jealous of the fact that Major Despard does notice Rhoda, although not as much as he notices Anne. But again, the text is very subtle. The text is very, very subtle about how Major Despard, he likes them both, but he likes Rhoda more, and that gives Anne another reason to murder Rhoda by shoving her off the boat that they are punting down in the local river to drown Rhoda. This is exactly the kind of crime that Anne Meredith does. It is an opportunistic one. I hope it will work.
She was a thief, and that the lovely trick that Poirot plays in the book is acted out in the adaptation about the stockings. Which I love the way that was set up.
Oh, it was a great setup. It was a great setup. And of course, Rhoda goes off with Poirot to look at a dagger that was used by 12 people to murder a man on the Orient Express. And she's like, oh, yes, let me see that. And in the meantime, Anne Meredith is sorting through the 19 pairs of different kinds of stockings to pick out six for a gift. And she steals 2 pairs of stockings.
Right, because Poirot mentions, I have like 13 or 14 of them here, so he obviously does not know the exact count of stockings, so she feels comfortable.
She feels comfortable stealing a couple of pairs of very expensive stockings. But it isn't set up right, because in the book, he is already suspecting her of theft. There are conversations about some of the previous employers that she has had, one who is very slapdash in her housekeeping, and if a ring goes missing, if a little money goes missing, she's not going to realize that it was the nice, sweet, mild companion. But the old lady who was poisoned by drinking the stuff from the improperly marked bottle, that old lady was a difficult old lady to live with. She was very exacting, and she knew immediately when something was being stolen, and she saw Anne stealing something, and so, of course, Anne had to murder her because Anne panicked. She is panic prone. This all got changed around, and then suddenly you find out, no, it wasn't Anne who deliberately poisoned Mrs. Benson. It was Rhoda who deliberately poisoned her own aunt so that she could make Anne into her love slave.
So at the very end of the adaptation, when we have Anne going off with Major Despard to darkest Africa, he's going off with a thief.
He's going off with the wrong girl. And in fact, they changed the whole scene on the boat, which is that Anne shoves Rhoda overboard and Major Despard races. Everybody shows up at the right time. And he really does, because Anne shoves Rhoda off the boat. It's a punt, which means that Rhoda is standing upright in the boat and moving a pole back and forth in the river. It's probably not terribly deep enough to drown if you panic. You can drown in a very small amount of water if you panic.
Also doesn't help if being beaten over the head because they were rowing in the adaptation.
That's right. In the adaptation, they were using rowboats. They were using rowboats, not punting.
Right.
In the film, Rhoda shoves Anne in, but in the book, Anne pushes Rhoda into the water, and then they upend the punt, and both girls end up in the water. And Major Despard has to make a snap decision, and he chooses to save Rhoda, not Anne. And Anne drowns. They aren't able to rescue her. Superintendent Battle also apparently goes into the water to drag everybody ashore. This was 180 degrees turnaround. Rhoda's character was completely rewritten, and in fact, she ended up with a lot of the attitudes that Anne has in the novel, and I couldn't accept that. I mean, I could accept a lot of changes. I could accept the gay subtext for Roberts because, hey, why not? And I could even accept making Anne Mrs. Lorimer's estranged daughter. I could even accept that because it does help if you tie everything more closely together for dramatic purposes. I could accept that. I could not accept Rhoda and Anne switching personalities, Major Despard going off with the wrong girl. I could not accept Superintendent Wheeler turning into a fine, upstanding man with a wife and family with a secret gay life that he allows to be photographed despite being a superintendent at Scotland Yard. And the one that we haven't discussed, which is worst of all, I could not accept that Mr. Shaitana set up that dinner party with 4 murderers and 4 sleuths and then baited them. And then as he has them set up in their 2 respective separate rooms, he sits in the room with the murderers and takes the sleeping drug himself to see what happens next. What? I kept the first half, like I said, first half of this film, I was really enjoying it. And then it was just like, what? What? They did what? They did what? At least there were boats and horses.
And I had the same problem, but I thought it was more because I really disliked the fact they didn't set this up. There was no indication, because it sounds like Shaitana is tired of life. He wants to go out. And yet he doesn't exhibit any of that.
Yeah, he doesn't exhibit any of that. He doesn't exhibit a world-weary ennui. And if he is going to do a world-weary ennui, then he is not going to drug himself so he is asleep when someone tries to murder him. That doesn't make any sense. If he is looking for sensation, he wants to be awake for this.
Yeah, he wants to be around to enjoy this. At least I would think so. But again, and yeah, all this stuff came out, a lot of this stuff came out in the last 20 minutes. It was all these turnarounds, and it was just one revelation after another, and it was just too much to bear.
It was too much to bear. A few of them, Mrs. Lorimer and Anne being related, I could accept that. Hey, again, you're for dramatic emphasis. I could even accept Dr. Roberts chasing his male patients instead of his female patients. I could even accept that. I couldn't accept Superintendent Wheeler. I could not accept the personality transplants between Anne and Rhoda and the entire lesbian subtext. And I could not accept that Mr. Shaitana planned all of this so that, knowing that somebody there was going to try to kill him and he wanted to experience it, so he took a sleeping drug so he wouldn't experience it.
Which is really sad, because this was, again, like all the other movies we've seen, especially the last 4 or 5, like The Hollows. They were beautifully shot. The flashbacks were really well put together. The acting was
first rate.
Excellent.
The acting is first rate. Everything looked great. Everything sounded great. Beautifully filmed. I'm sure that there would be people who would object to the scenes in Egypt because it's obvious that they didn't go to Egypt to film those skies.
Yeah,
and those hotels.
It was against the backdrop, but I kind of like that.
I have a problem with that, because these are flashbacks. These are memories.
Yeah.
And memories edit out all of the little details, like the litter on the ground or the camels that are shitting in back of you. You edit out all of that.
It had a very romantic cast. You could tell it was a backdrop, but at the same time, it just worked. I was
it worked for me.
I was just amused by it all.
I had no problems with any of that. Everything looked absolutely fabulous. Ariadne Oliver has a great sports car. We get to see Major Despard with some really fine horses doing some really fine riding. We get a boat. We get Anne and Rhoda on a boat. And, oh, God, this story was just so stupid in the last half. It was just stupid.
Well, this leads to the question then, would you recommend it? Or how would you recommend it? Would somebody who did not read the book really accept this?
I think if someone didn't read the book, they could probably handle almost everything except for the fact that Mr. Shaitana taking the drug was really poorly set up. That would probably be the main objection, because you wouldn't know with anything else what they had messed up on, what they had changed around. But they did not set up Shaitana looking essentially for assisted suicide, because that's really what it was. They did not do any kind of a setup for Major Shaitana, or for Mr. Shaitana wanting to die and wanting someone else to do it for him, like death by cop. Mm-hmm. They did not set that up in any way, shape, or form, and particularly needing to be unconscious when he's experiencing the final experience that any human being can have, which is to step through the veil and cross over into that undiscovered country from which no one ever returns. And do you get any kind of a setup for that? No.
There's nothing to say, I want to leave behind a mystery that people will talk about for generations.
Exactly. And a theatrical man like that, he is not going to go quietly into that good night. He is going to make as much noise and attract as much attention as possible. I don't know. If you know the novel, you're going to be disappointed. Mm-hmm. For the second half, you're going to be disappointed. For the first half, you're going to love it. For the second half, you're going to say, what? And you're going to throw your popcorn at the screen. If you've not read the novel, you'll probably be fine. You will probably be okay, because you won't know any better, particularly about Anne and Rhoda and Major Despard going back into the wilds of Africa with whiny, thieving Anne instead of brave, stalwart, adventuresome Rhoda.
True. Anne was something of a damp dish rag.
She was a dish
character.
rag.
Well, that concludes our discussion of Cards on the Table.
Thanks so much for joining us, folks.
Next time, we're going to be doing After the Funeral. or Funerals Are Fatal, depending on where you live.
Oh, yes, this is going to be really interesting because for those of you who, we weren't doing podcasts at the time, folks, but this was also filmed with Margaret Rutherford as Miss Marple. And if you think that Funerals Are Fatal had Miss Marple in it, you're wrong. It did not. It is a Poirot film, so it's going to be really interesting because I will have Margaret Rutherford's version in the back of my mind. Mm-hmm. And
now you just read the book, didn't you? And you really wondered how they were going to adapt it, or was that Taken at the Flood I was thinking of?
I can't remember now.
Well, we'll find out next time.
We'll find out when we do Funerals Are Fatal, and no, Margaret Rutherford is not going to be in this.
Well, and this is Bill Peschel.
And Teresa Peschel.
And this was Agatha Christie We Watched. And I'll see you at the movies.
Bye-bye.